Hello, everybody. You are listening to the Soberful Podcast. I'm Veronica Valli, and I'm joined today by Melissa Stoeltje. Welcome, Melissa.
Thanks for having me, Veronica.
Now, I wanted to interview Melissa because Melissa has a book that has just come out called Drunk Love, A Marriage Under the Influence. And it's about her. So you've been sober how long have you been? Since 2010?
Since September 12, 2010. So I'm I'm coming up on 15 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I think that like a relationship based on around alcohol being such a big part of it is really, really common. That's why I wanted to get you on to kind of hear your process and all that kind of stuff. Now, you are a writer because you're a reporter, right? You've been a reporter for a long time.
Well, I retired in 2010. My newspaper offered a COVID buyout, which I took. But before that, I'd worked over 3 decades in newspaper journalism at the San Antonio Light, the Houston Chronicle for 9 years. And then my last 20 years, I worked at the San Antonio Express News. I've done freelance work for the New York Times and the San Antonio Report. I've been a columnist. But for most of my writing career, I covered like marginalized communities like addiction, ironically enough, mental illness, poverty. I'm drawn to stories that are, from the voiceless. So yeah. And then I retired and had this book coming out, and I've written a second book that we can talk about if you're interested. But yeah, I've been a writer my whole life, which is kind of part of why I wanted to write this book. That's what writers do. We try to make sense of our lives by putting some kind of truth down on paper. So that's what I did.
Fantastic. Okay. So can we go back to, can you tell us about, I guess, your drinking and your relationship then? Where do we start? Where's the best place to start?
Well, and it's interesting that the title Drunk Love, A Marriage Under the Influence really kind of has 2 meanings, because it addresses the impact my drinking, my alcoholism had on my marriage. And then also the impact my sobriety had on my marriage, because, we thought, Mark, my husband, and I thought that, once I stopped drinking, all the problems in our marriage would like magically go away overnight. We were naive in that way. And yeah, a whole new set of things came up. But really, I just quickly about my own recovery journey. I started drinking in high school, like a lot of, people that go on to have alcohol use disorder. I started early. There were some drugs, in my teens and 20s, but alcohol was always my first love. And what's interesting about my story, I say I was a high functioning alcoholic. What does that mean? I think as alcoholics, we're like snowflakes. We're all the same, but we're all different, right? And so my story is kind of unusual that you don't really hear in the rooms of AA a lot. And I'm going to go ahead and name AA. In my book, I don't. I just call it the program for anonymity reasons. But,
yeah,
you often hear people that when they start drinking right out of the gate, they start having those consequences that we associate with alcoholism, like, blackouts and, DUIs and lost jobs and being kicked out of school and morning drinking. Well, my story is a little different. I drank for many decades. I drank too much for many decades. I became a nightly drinker, really my junior year of college, without, experiencing any of those consequences. I graduated high school. I went, graduated college. I built, got a master's degree in English. I got married, had a child, had a successful career, in journalism. And it was always just great fun. I met my husband when I was 26, and, he was a New Orleans boy and he liked to party too. So we, it was a match made in heaven in that way. So from the beginning of our relationship, from our courtship on, drinking was something that we did together. It was how we had fun. It was part of our intimacy. It was just, part of our life to drink wine or whatever every night and, get up, go to work, drink more on the weekends. And then when I hit 47, it's like a switch flipped, and it seems like almost overnight, I crossed that line that we talk about in the rooms. Like I went from a cucumber to a pickle. And what started happening was I would get drunk and start slurring and being loud and, being drunk. But really, it only happened sort of within the 4 walls of my home. Out in the world, those last 5 years of my drinking, because I ended up getting sober at age 52. So those last 5 years of my drinking, I still looked great on paper. I didn't lose my job. I didn't have a DUI, mostly because my husband drove everywhere. But my husband's son, the 2 people who are the most important people in my life, they're the ones who saw my disease. I think like a lot of female alcoholics, I was kind of a secret closet drinker. I did most of my drinking, heavy drinking at home. And what started happening after age 47, I would have these things called my incidents, where I would, overshoot the mark, drink too much, slur, be drunk in front of my son and my husband. And then I'd say, okay, I'm going to get sober. And I would go to AA meetings, and I even did a stint in IOP, intensive outpatient treatment. But I would always sort of talk myself back into not being an alcoholic. We say that alcoholism is the disease of denial. It's the disease that tells sufferers that they don't have it. And because I still look good on paper, even though, I say that, but I wasn't really, those last 5 years, I wasn't functioning at top speed at my work. I kind of lost my passion for writing, because my life had drilled down to how much can I drink tonight? Is my husband in the mood to get drunk? Can I get drunk? Or is he watching the wine levels in the refrigerator? Because he sort of became my monitor. I would have these incidents, and he would get mad. And then days or weeks would pass, and he'd be drinking with me again, because he liked to drink with me. That's what we did together. So, he enabled me in that way for those last 5 years. But, I started hiding little bottles of wine in my closet, or, chugging a beer on the way home from work, the things that we do so we can get that feeling that we chase to the gates of hell. So yeah, the last 5 years, it was whiplash. I'd go in and out of AA, kind of get with the program, never really did step one all the way. My husband would go in and out of Al-Anon. We were stuck in this really destructive cycle that, as my disease deepened and progressed, because we know that alcoholism is a progressive disease. It always gets worse. It never gets better. And my incidents started happening closer and closer together. So, yeah, it was a crazy time. And Mark would admit that, by the end, he was every bit as sick as I was. Addiction is a disease it kills relationships. We alcoholics and addicts, we drive the people who love us crazy. And, by the end, he was every bit as sick as I was. And it took this one sort of dramatic night that finally turned things around.
What can you tell us about that night?
So I was 52. I had just started taking this new medication for my chronic insomnia, which kind of figures into my story a little bit down the road. But we went to go see the Jersey Boys at the Majestic Theater. And, we drank beforehand, we drank, during. And that's when I had really my first significant blackout. I'd had what I call brownouts before that, like where we'd have dinner parties and I'd get drunk, and I could remember saying goodbye to people, but I couldn't remember what did we talk about around the table. I'd see movies and big chunks would be missing. So I was having memory issues, but I always found a way to explain it away. I was just tired. Because I told myself, because I'd been in the rooms of AA long enough to know that blackouts are a big sign of alcoholic drinking. And I told myself, if I ever have a serious blackout, that'll be my sign. I didn't want to admit I was an alcoholic, but that would be my sign. So we went to Jersey Boys, and even though we were sitting on the fourth row, there was a lot of singing and dancing. My brain laid down not a whit of it. I finally had, the blackout, and I came to on the way home, as we were driving home, and started talking, and I was, just, couldn't understand me. And that was a turning point for my husband. The next morning he woke up and he said, look, I can't do this anymore. You've told me you were going to stop, you were going to moderate, this is ruining our marriage and our lives. And he packed a suitcase and he left. And, for once he wasn't screaming at me. He wasn't angry. He was perfectly calm.
Whoa.
It scared the shit out of me. And so what I did was I called this therapist, Joan, who I had seen 6 months earlier, during one of my stints at trying to be sober. And I'd lied to her about the extent of my drinking and, how I was hurting my son, that my son had begged me to stop drinking, and I drank again. So I called her the day after the blackout, and she had me come in on Monday. That was part of the miracle. How many therapists call over the weekend and make an appointment? But so I went and I sat down, and I was finally, completely honest with her about, the toll it was taking on my motherhood and my marriage. And I was hiding drinks, and I had this blackout. And she's like, Melissa, you're a chronic relapse, so you need to go to rehab. And I was like, I can't go to rehab. My bosses don't know that I have a drinking problem. I can't be gone for 30 days. I mean, you're crazy. But she also gave me the number of this woman named Kathy. And she says, this is going to be your sponsor. So I met Kathy that night at Club 12, which is sort of the headquarters for AA in San Antonio. There's, meetings all the time. And for some reason that night, Veronica, we talk about the gift of desperation and the moments of clarity. Kathy sat down next to me and she, I vomited my whole story out, everything that had been going on for the last 5 years. And she's like, I agree. You need to go to rehab. And I was like, I can't go. We're having a party for my son, a college graduation party. He'll want me to be there. And she looked at me, she said, Melissa, your son wants you to be sober. And for some reason that like cracked a little, a little door in my heart and a shaft of light came in. And I was like, wow. And I said, Kathy, how can you have a fun life without alcohol? By that point, as the book says, our alcoholic life is the only one we come to know. It's the normal life that we have. And we can't imagine not drinking, just like we can't imagine drinking anymore. We're in that place, that jumping off place. And I said, can you ever have fun as a sober person? And all she did, she just nodded. And there was this light coming out of her eyes. I can't explain it. It was sort of otherworldly. And I grabbed onto that light and, I called Mark and I said, I'm going to rehab. And he was like, what? The man that wanted me to get sober was like, you can't go to rehab. But, over the next couple of days, I was calling all these places and, it was hard to find a place because I didn't need to detox. I never really had hangovers, but I never had, the strong withdrawals that can be so dangerous.
Yeah, same.
Yeah. And it's like, they wouldn't let me in. My insurance wouldn't cover it unless I, had to go to detox. But then I talked to this guy at Starlight, which is this, pretty well-known rehab in the Texas Hill Country. And he's like, let me see if I can't work it out. And, he worked it out and off I went to rehab. And, I was just befuddled. I was stunned. I couldn't believe I found myself. Those are the kind of places I wrote about as a journalist. And now here I was. But some pretty amazing things happened in rehab that just turned it all around. That I went in not believing in God, not believing in a higher power. But a series of things happened that I call my divine coincidences. And it felt like this invisible wind was pushing at my back, pushing me towards sobriety, pushing me toward, finally fully doing that first step. And it's like my life did a 180 after that. And I can't explain it. All I can tell you is that it happened. And that's my story and I'm sticking with it.
I want to just highlight something here that is so interesting that you said. And it's you got to this bit where it's like, oh God, rehab. Like that means I have to stop drinking forever. Like, will I ever have fun again? Yeah. But what you have been describing, and this is a textbook example of denial. And one of the things I say to people all the time, that all sobriety is a shift in perception. Yes. You just see everything differently. So you're having a dinner party with nice food and friends, and you can't remember chunks of it. Like you're just absent. You're not there. You're not like, there's no authentic connection. There's no authentic laughing. There's no, like you can't even remember it. What is fun about that? Right. But and again, like you went to a show, like a great show and you can't, and we think if this will be a great time, right? I'll go to a show, love the show, great music. This will be a great time. How can I make a great time just a little bit better? I know. I'll add alcohol to it. Exactly. If I add alcohol to this event will be a better event. Yeah. However, the reality is you pay all of that money, you take all of that time, and you can't remember the show. You're not present. You're not connected to it. It's a nothing. Like that is textbook denial, right?
Exactly.
We cannot see it. We cannot see it. We think like, oh, and then I'm sure you were hungover for, and we cannot see the cost. So it's so ingrained in us that alcohol's the best way to have fun and relax and unwind. And if there is an event of any kind and we add alcohol to the event will be a better event. Complete and utter. I just, when you said that, I'm like, that is such a great example of it. And I'm sure you have so many. I do. I mean, I only drank for 12 years. I have so many examples of when I look back and go, that wasn't fun.
It wasn't fun. And, it's so interesting. in modern culture, I say it's almost like wine and women have become synonymous.
Yeah.
Everything you see on TV and movies, women have these big goblets of wine and they're, mommy day out. And it's like, it's become so normalized. And it's like, how can I go to a Mexican restaurant and not get trashed on margaritas? How do I go to a wedding and not get trashed on champagne? It becomes the normal. And it's like, when I finally stopped drinking, we had friends that were heavy drinkers because, heavy drinkers find heavy drinkers.
Yeah, I bet you did. I bet you did.
Oh, I did. This one couple in particular that we traveled with, we did holidays with. And once I got sober, they could have dropped me like a hot potato. And it was very painful until my therapist and my sponsor both said, that's about them more than it is about you. And we continue to have friends who drink. But what I found out that first year in sobriety was like, a lot of people have one or two drinks and that's all they want. And it's like, wow, what a concept. So, we have friends that are moderate drinkers, but they love me. I'm more fun now because I don't pass out at 9:00. I can remember everything that happens. My jokes are funny. They're authentically funny, not that ha ha ha, and I don't slur. So it's like a whole new way to live. But, we're still in this drinking culture that valorizes and, tells you've got to have alcohol to have a good time. So it's interesting to see how some of these studies are coming out showing that even moderate drinking can pose, cancer risks and all that. And especially for women, because our bodies.
It's 3 glasses of wine a week raises your risk by 15%. It's a tiny amount of alcohol. And everybody who drank, you probably thought you were a moderate drinker, did you? Because you didn't drink every day.
Yeah. Well, I drank wine every night and I would go on and take those online alcoholism tests, that they have. And it's like, I'd always try to fudge it to make it sound like, maybe that's a no, but you ought to add those questions. Do you repeatedly take online alcoholism tests? But the interesting.
How many times have you Googled, do I have an alcohol problem? There you go.
And it's like normal people don't have to do that. They don't have to take those tests at work and hide the screen. And
my husband's never done that. He's never gone, I wonder if I'm drinking too much, because he barely drinks.
But what's interesting though, since, I would go to meetings and I'd hear about people drinking a bottle of vodka a day or, 2 12-packs of beer a day. And my quantities were less than that. Toward the end, I could drink a bottle of wine and still need some more, but that wasn't, as much. But so I would always compare. I don't drink that much. But when I went to rehab, they told us, when you get out, go see a doctor to get a clean bill of health. So I went to my doctor, and mind you, this was about 2 months before 2 months since I'd had a drink. And my liver panels came back through the roof. And I asked my doctor, I was stunned. I said, does this mean that I could have been at risk for cirrhosis? And he said, well, you may have some of that going on right now. And Veronica, you could have knocked me over with a feather. I thought there's no way I could be impacting my body with the amounts that I drank. But that, women's bodies, we react differently. The damage is more significant. The good news is I went back since 6 months and my liver was fine. If it doesn't go too far, it can rejuvenate, but it doesn't always do that.
Best. So you said you were 50. How old were you? 52? Yeah.
Yes.
Our body, it's never too late. I have clients in their 70s whose health has improved within a year. Like everything, numbers, mobility, weight. It doesn't matter how old you are. I really want people to understand that it doesn't matter how old you are. You will see quite dramatic improvements in your health.
That's wonderful.
I'm interested in, you said, we thought, so you went to rehab.
Mm-hmm.
You missed your son's graduation party.
Yep.
How was it when you came out of rehab?
So, Mark and Sam is my son. They came to family day, and, I had a lot of guilt, with my son, because I told him over, those 5 years I'm going to quit, then I would start. And, after a while, children, they just lose trust. The shade goes down in their eyes because, of course, we're lying to them and they know that. But we left, and my husband told me he was going to stop drinking too to support me, even though he wasn't really an alcoholic. But we came, I jumped into AA with both feet. He jumped into Al-Anon with both feet. And we both saw this therapist, Joan, both individually and together as marriage counseling. And what was interesting is that over those last 5 years, like I said, Mark had become sick too. He was the angry, hectoring, Al-Anon, untreated Al-Anon. And I was the poor little guilty, shame-based wife, drunk wife. So we get out and I start getting healthier, 90 meetings in 90 days. I was like a sponge. And so some of that shame started dropping away, and he didn't know what to do with me. We were stuck in this pattern, and here I was changing, and the whole dynamics of our marriage started to change. How are we going to be together with me not drinking? And, there were some dynamics that even predated my disease from our, both of our families of origin. We brought trauma in. So we had to start, it was like our marriage was starting over. And I would like to say we did a great job, but, around 6 months sober, Mark wanted to separate from me again. And it was this horrible weekend. And he's like, you only got sober because I threatened to leave you. He had so much anger and resentment that he was holding on from the pain I'd caused him and the pain I'd caused our son. So we had a lot to work through. And there were some, really iffy times. He stayed. And, I have to say we were both just very committed. We had heard the statistics that even in marriages where the alcoholic gets sober, a majority end in divorce. And we didn't want that to happen to us. So, we just worked really hard, and we went to retreats about marriage. And I want to add a caveat that in some marriages, divorce is the answer. Addiction has caused too much pain and there's no going back. And I have no judgment, but yeah. I did one reason I wanted to write the book, even though it's not a self-help book, I think there's sort of a narrative embedded into the story about how to get back, how to heal that relationship if there's still time, there's still love, that it is possible not only to recover if you're a high functioning alcoholic, trapped in denial, but how marriages and relationships with kids can be resurrected and renewed. And, it's amazing. I'm so grateful that we were able to do that. But again, it's not always the case. But yeah. And then, I have to add, when I was about 6 months sober, Mark decided it was okay for him to drink again because he wasn't an alcoholic. I was like, how dare you? I got sober for you, which is so ridiculous. And there was another weekend of I was full of resentment. You should not drink to support me. And then, my therapist and also my sponsor, they told me, look, Melissa, your sobriety is between you and your higher power. It's not between you and your husband. This is an inside job. He's got nothing to do with it. And I found out through a couple of events that I could be okay with him drinking. I could be okay around people drinking. I was in that safe, neutral zone that we talk about with the psychic change. And, that was another one of those miracles that just came to be, that I was okay in a drinking world. The interesting thing is now my husband, who's 67, I'm 66, I'm 67, he hardly drinks at all, but it's because he's old and he can't sleep well if he has more than one drink. There's beer in our refrigerator right now, but it doesn't call my name, and I know some people in the program, they don't serve alcohol. They don't spend time around people that drink, but it's okay. You do you, whatever works for you. Again, no judgment. So, yeah.
So it was a lot of kind of untangling the codependency
Yes.
and the really toxic patterns of relating that you had got into. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was just, like I said, over those last 5 years, we locked into this pattern where I was full of guilt. He was full of rage. How do we even talk to each other? How are we going to be together without me drinking? It was just such a common part of our relationship. Everything we did revolved around alcohol. So you take that out and here I am unmediated. There's no buffer. How do we relate as two human beings with a lot of pain and a lot of brokenness? It wasn't an overnight job. Like I said, we did a lot of therapy, a lot of meetings, and it was just really, I say that our true marriage, after 25 years of marriage, our true marriage was starting as two individuals unmediated by alcohol. How do we work through the pain and the resentment that my drinking caused? And, today it's a human marriage. I'm not presenting that we have some sort of perfect marriage. We have our moments. The whole first year of sobriety, we had Joan on speed dial. I envisioned her seeing our name going, oh my God, not them again. But, we had to work around, intimacy and, having a good time and, him respecting me and, kind of letting go of that sort of superior position, which is what we had locked into. How do we become equals in this marriage? And, all I can say is I've got a marriage today. We're going to celebrate 40 years in November that I couldn't have imagined. We have so much fun together. The tools of our program, we use it every day in our relationships. We have a saying in our house, whoever apologizes first wins. Making amends is a big part of our relationship. And we don't go to church. we go to Club 12, which is again the headquarters. We go there every Sunday for the speaker meeting, and that's kind of our spiritual home. We found spirituality together in our respective programs, and it's just been amazing. And in my relationship with my son, we've been able to sit down, and I've been able to apologize to him in an authentic way, and he's been able to tell me about the pain I caused him. His whole first year of college, he didn't drink because of me. He had to start seeing a therapist because of anxiety. And that's, if I could change anything in my recovery, it would have been, I wouldn't have hurt my son. But that's what happened. The past is the past. We don't regret it or wish to shut the door on it. And he and I have the most amazing relationship. I get to make my living amends to him, which is to stay sober one day at a time for the rest of my life. But that pain I caused him is part of his journey. And we talk about in the program, pain that's not transformed gets transmitted, but pain can be used to the good. It's how we help each other, right? We connect through our brokenness in the fellowship. And, Sam is going to hopefully use that pain. He's an amazing writer. Maybe that's going to be part of his journey. And we have to trust God that things happen for a reason. They got me to where I am today. They got me to the marriage I have today and to the relationship with my son. And I have to be grateful. I know not everybody gets this program, and that's a mystery. I don't know why, but I did. And my God, I'm just so thankful every day.
I find, thank you for talking about your son, because I think, again, it's a huge piece of work, isn't it? It's a huge piece of work as a parent, to resolve that. Can you say a little bit more, like the journey of resolving that within yourself? And
Well, it's funny because I told myself, my father left when I was 6. He was an alcoholic and he beat my mother. And then my mother raised 3 girls by herself, and she had her own anger issues. There were lots of, whippings on the butt with a belt, the bare butt. And so I had told myself, I am going to be super mom. My son is not going to have any fear. He's going to know he's unconditionally loved, no beatings with a belt. And here I was, causing my son the greatest pain in his life, in his young life. And, as I said, there was a time when I say that maternal love is maybe the strongest force in the world, but you know what? Addiction can be stronger. And, there was a time early on when he burst into tears and begged me to stop drinking. And I'd like to say that was the turning point, but I drank for 4 more years after that.
Yeah.
So, there was a lot of, with him just, and he came to Family Day, and I know he also read Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. And he took it upon himself to learn about that this is a disease. I wasn't a bad mother. I was a sick mother. And, I'm so glad that Sam has learned about the disease, and that it's, it's a matter, we lose our power of choice. It's not that I didn't love him. I was just in the grip of something that was bigger than me. And, we've been able to have conversations about that. And, nowadays when we get together, we talk about writing and politics. It's almost like we've kind of dealt with that. But I have to remember, in my lizard brain, I'm still an alcoholic. I'll be an alcoholic till the day I die. And if I want to keep this healed relationship with my son and his respect and his trust, I've got to keep doing the little things I've got to do every day that we all have to, to keep that fit spiritual connection. But if you ask me, what's the biggest gift of my sobriety? It's, the healing with my son, and then my ability to live a more authentic life. The mask can kind of come off that we all wear, right? And it's that turning down of the, my factory setting is fear.
Same, right?
Yeah.
That when I got I was about 6 months in the program, and I didn't know if I was going to stay or go, because I was considerably younger. I didn't relate to any of the stories. Like, I didn't drink every day. I didn't drink first thing in the morning. And it was a middle-aged man who spoke about fear in a meeting. And I went, and I just sat there, and my first thought was, I thought I was the only one.
Yes.
I thought everyone else was fine.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't fear. I lived my life in blind terror.
Yeah.
And that's why I drank.
Yep. Yeah.
Right?
I had anxiety. I had panic attacks starting like in elementary school.
Same. Mine started as a teenager. Yeah. Same.
The pounding heart. Yeah. It's amazing, the similarities. And it's like,
we're so common garden and unoriginal.
Oh, I know. It's like we're all in the same textbook, right? And it's like that fear that you're not going to like me, or I'm not going to measure up. I'm not good enough. And it's incredible I remember one time early on, I was in a meeting and this guy was talking about being a people pleaser and his addiction. And he was at a party one time and somebody asked him, where are you from? And he actually had the thought, where do you want me to be from? It's crazy. And you know, yeah, it's like you take the mask off. And I'm not saying that I'm fearless. I mean, I still have my moment, but man, that fear thermostat's been way turned down where, you know, not everybody's going to like me, and that's okay. I love that saying from Eleanor Roosevelt that you wouldn't worry so much what other people think about you if you realized how seldom they do. We are not the center of the universe, and there's liberation in that. It doesn't really matter. The stuff that I would get twisted up about, 2 weeks down the road, it's not going to matter. So why am I worrying about it now? Let it go, turn it over, just live life one day at a time, doing the next right thing, and let everything else fall away. As long as I have my sobriety, that's the first priority. Everything else is going to be fine. I'm going to be okay. And to me, that's one of the greatest gifts of sobriety, that okayness, And what I found too is that once you stop dumping alcohol on your brain, I was worried about life being pleasurable. I have so much pleasure in the small things now. Life is really unfiltered. Life is pretty wonderful. That first cup of coffee in the morning, the rainstorm blowing in, I come home and there's a new copy of the New Yorker in my mailbox and I'm happy as a pig in shit, and it's like, who could have thought life can be so abundant without putting, alcohol on your brain? But of course it is, of course it is.
Can you tell me, so back to when you realized you had to stop and you were like, oh my God, will I have fun again? What did you discover about fun?
Yeah. And I have to add that telling an alcoholic they have to quit drinking, it feels like asking them to jump off a cliff with no parachute.
Yeah.
It's like asking, you're going to have to die, basically. And you step off and you're like, is something going to catch me? And, they say the promises come sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. I remember distinctly, maybe I was a couple months sober. I was sitting in a stoplight in the morning on the way to work. And all of a sudden it dawned on me that I hadn't thought about opening a bottle of wine for days and days. And I started screaming, thank you, thank you. And I wasn't quite sure who or what I was thanking, but I knew something monumental had happened because I tried for 5 years to stop drinking wine every night and I just couldn't. And now it was becoming easy. And, we went to things where people were drinking. And in the beginning, I kind of monitored who's drinking what, who's drinking how much. And that finally went away over time. But I realized you could go to a party and you could talk to people and listen to what they said. And it was interesting. And there was beautiful food and there was laughter. And you could go home and go to sleep and wake up the next morning and not feel like, dog poop and remember what happened. And that I feel like I'm more fun now. I'm more sparkly. I love to make people laugh. And it's like, who would have thunk that I could have a good time out in the world, without that? It's one of the many miracles. And my career was rejuvenated. I got to work for another decade sober. And it's like, I had lost my passion for writing. Like I said, man, I won a bunch of awards. I was a good employee. And all of this came, putting $1 in the basket and getting on your knees and asking for help from your higher power, who I choose to call God. I know higher power can be anything. And it was so simple. And I fought it for 5 years. That's the irony, that it gave me my life back. What's that saying? In addiction, we give up everything for one thing. In recovery, what is it again? We keep one thing and get everything back. We get rid of one thing and get everything back. That's what happened to me. And I just, if I could have talked to myself in denial and, shaken my shoulders saying, you're fighting this and it's wonderful. You'll become who you truly are. Just take the risk, jump off the cliff. But it took what it took, for all of us, it takes what it takes. And all that pain I suffered, all that, shame, it got me where I am today. So I can't begrudge it. I truly am grateful for all that. I wish I hadn't hurt my son, but it takes what it takes. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I have one more. You talked about like when you stopped drinking, you had some friends that were very heavy drinkers that dropped you like a brick, which is like, don't want to see that. How did that, like, did anyone else in your circle stop drinking? Like, because I always describe it as we have to renegotiate our friendships. They're renegotiated. Yes. And some people are like, we socialize, we drink.
Yeah.
And other people are kind of like, yeah, well, I'd love to go to a hike or a movie or a coffee, right? Like, what can you just like, what was your experience?
So this couple, like I say, they were really our steadfast drinking friends, and they just sort of dropped me, and I was hurt till I was told, it's not really about you.
Yeah.
My family, I got sober in September, and then the first Christmas, my sister was like, we're not going to drink. We're not going to drink. And by then I was like, look, it's okay. If you want to have a couple drinks, it really doesn't bother me. And she was like, adamant. No, we're not. And I came into the kitchen at one point, and my brother-in-law was pouring a beer into like a big styrofoam, one of those go cups with a plastic lid and a straw. I was like, Tim, you don't have to hide it, But what I found out, we have a lot of friends in AA, some of our dearest friends, we do a lot with. And what I find is, I'm not saying I have a better time with them, but we laugh so much. We've been in restaurants where I'm afraid they're going to kick us out because they think we're drunk because we're laughing so much.
Yeah. Everything's so real, isn't it?
I
It's
know.
so much more real.
It is. It's not that fake drunk laugh. It's that real, and we do have friends. We have a number of couples that, again, they drink, but they drink moderately.
Yeah.
And every now and then I'll bring up, AA, because I don't broadcast the fact that I'm in recovery, although with this book, I guess I am. But, every now and then I'll say something like, oh, in AA, we did, and there'll be kind of a silence. I think it kind of makes people uncomfortable, but they accept me. They love me. I feel so wanted, and I don't feel like I've been tossed off because I'm a sober person. But it's really interesting that, I know there are people in the program that if you're somewhere and you're getting a Diet Coke and somebody says, why aren't you drinking? And, you might say, well, I got an early day in the morning, or I'm on antibiotics. I tell people I'm an alcoholic in recovery, and I do that because I have no shame around it. I had a lot of shame around my drinking, but I don't have any shame about being in remission from a fatal disease. Because you never know. They might say, really, why are you in recovery? And maybe I'll explain a little bit. And they're like, well, I have a brother-in-law who I'm worried about. So you can plant little seeds. But I know some folks don't do that. And again, you do you, whatever makes you feel comfortable. But I feel like I can kind of be an ambassador for recovery, and because there's still a lot of stigma around being an alcoholic or an addict. It's much better now that every other celebrity is in recovery.
Mm-hmm.
But I just feel like if somebody asks me, I'm going to tell them the truth. Yeah, that's where I'm at.
What's your hopes for this book?
Well, yeah, I hope that when I was still drinking, there's been a lot of recovery memoirs written by female alcoholics, and I think I've read them all. And I read them when I was still drinking to kind of compare myself, like I'm not as bad as she is, And then I read them in sobriety, and it hit me a whole different way. So I hope maybe I know there's women out there who drink like I used to drink, right? That were closet drinkers, high functioning, feeling like they don't belong in AA because everybody's worse off than they are. I want to show them that, you don't have to take the elevator all the way down to the basement to claim your chair in recovery, or any other treatment modality that you choose, whether it's AA or, motivational interviewing, or, cognitive behavioral therapy, or psilocybin trips twice a year, or Ozempic, or whatever people choose. So I want to get it out there that, my story's a little different. Maybe somebody can connect. Maybe it can help them not stay sick as long as I did. I hope it's for people like my husband who would love someone with alcohol use disorder and show them there's a way. Maybe it's tough love. I didn't finally take the step towards real recovery until Mark packed a suitcase and left me. That's what it took. So, again, it's not self-help, but I'm hoping it'll offer kind of a roadmap out of high denial drinking, out of, the damage you've done to your relationships. I hope maybe therapists and clinicians might get it for their patients. I think that it's a pretty big message. That's not a common one. That's maybe a little bit different, and get it out there, get it in the literature to help people, plus I hope they like it for the writing too. I did my best to write it in an imaginative way. So we'll see what happens. I'm already getting a few good reviews. So
that's great. And you said you have a second book? What's about that?
I do. So it's interesting. My best friend from middle school, I call her Vanessa in the book. That's not her real name. We were drinking buddies. We were drug buddies. She was my partner in crime. Well, she got married to this rich guy, and when she was 33, she was out jogging with her baby strapped in a stroller in this very, affluent wooded area of San Antonio, and a man jumped out and stabbed her to death.
Oh my God.
So, and it's a murder that's never been solved. The private eye that was hired said it was a contract hit. Somebody was there to kill her. And, so the book is it's got a true crime element, but it's about our friendship. It's called Unguarded Girls, A Tale of Friendship and a Life Cut Short. And it's kind of like the question is, why did she die and I survived? Because we were these two fatherless girls who got in lots of trouble. And so it's about that. And it's, the murder remains unsolved to this day. And it was really horrible. It was very traumatic, but I hope it's a sweet portrait of what we meant to each other and all the trouble we got up to.
Wow. I hope is that written?
It's written. I haven't tried to find an agent yet. I need to read it again. Writing is rewriting. And my husband is my first reader for everything that I write. And I have to give him kudos because this first book, he read it many times and he never once asked me to sanitize it to make him look better. He didn't come off great in the book. Neither do I. But, Mary Carr, who's my favorite writer in the world, she wrote a book called The Art of Memoir. And she said, if you're not willing to tell the truth, the good, the bad, and the ugly in your memoir, warts and all, you should just hang it up because you're just writing to make yourself look good. It's not going to work. You got to be truthful. So that's what I've tried to do. Yeah. So anyway, more to come.
Melissa, it's been great to meet you. I feel I identify very strongly with everything that you've said. And it is just, I love, my kind of mission is to show the world that sobriety is the opposite to everything that you think it is. It's like you don't miss out. It's like we're not like poor, deprived, boring people, right? It's when life begins. And
exactly. We're not a glum lot. We are not a glum lot.
We are not a glum lot. No. Oh my God. I've been sober 25 years. One thing I know for sure is alcoholics love to party. We love to party.
Yes, we're the feel-good people.
We are.
Yeah, I think people would be shocked and scandalized if they knew how much laughter goes on in AA meetings, because we're supposed to be just beating ourselves up, right?
Yeah.
But it's incredible. It's the best thing. I put it up there with my marriage and birth of my son, my sobriety. It's right up there. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Where can people find you? Are you on social media or where's the book?
Yes. So my author website is www.bymelissastoeltje.com. And that's all one word, melissastoeltje.com. And you can get the book on Amazon, Kindle. It's distributed by Simon & Schuster. I think mostly you need to go online, but wherever you can get books online, you can find it. So I hope people try to read it and get something out of it, get a connection. We heal in connection, right?
We do. Yeah. Thank you so much, Melissa. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. I know I have a lot of clients who will relate to this. I think it was a really strong story. I'd love to know what you think. Make sure you leave a review and you're following the show. And we will be taking a little summer break. So I'll be taking 2 months off in the summer just to let you know. All right, everybody, take care and I'll see you next week.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Veronica. Bye-bye.
I dreamt that you were twisting through 7 suns of gold, and the gypsy was insisting that a story must be told.